Hey everyone, welcome back. Last time we were together, we were talking about states of consciousness. And so today we're going to talk about altered states of consciousness. And so some of these that we are going to talk about you experience on a very regular basis, and some perhaps not. But let's go ahead and first talk about an altered state of consciousness that you experience literally every single night, and that is dreaming. Now, some of you may think, I don't dream. I fall asleep, I wake up in the morning, I don't have any dreams at all. And the reality is that's not true. You dream every single night. You dream during REM sleep. We can see this through looking at EEGs and brainwave activity. We can tell that you are dreaming. But the catch is, if you don't wake up during REM sleep, you're not going to remember that dream. If you go into REM sleep, have your dreams, and then immediately go into NREM1, those dreams are gone. So if you want to remember your dreams, you got to make sure you wake up while you are dreaming. Now, for as long as we've had dreams, people have been trying to figure out why are we dreaming or why do we dream. We've got a few different theories here. The first theory, psychoanalytic theory, that is established by Freud. There's not a lot of people who necessarily buy into the scientific validity of this theory, but it's certainly interesting, and it's interesting to psychology and the history of this course. And so, the idea behind the psychoanalytic theory is that your dreams are essentially the golden road to the unconscious mind. Remember, the unconscious mind is that part of your mind that you're not really aware of. Well, if we want to try to tap into your unconscious mind, we have to analyze your dreams. And so Freud would write about what he calls manifest and latent content. The manifest content of a dream is the actual plot of the dream itself. So if you have a dream that you go to the zoo and you get lost and you try to find your friends and you can't find them anywhere, and then all of a sudden you're in the monkey pen, right? That's the manifest content of the dream. A latent content is the symbolism. What does it mean? And so psychoanalytics would think about your dreams and try to find symbols within them. So maybe getting lost at the zoo is some kind of symbol for feeling lost in life and not having a direction in where you're going and things like that. I don't know, but that's the idea. Perhaps some more scientifically valid theories as to why we dream looks at these next two. So one theory as to why we dream is simply for informational processing. We know, for example, that while you dream, you are sifting through the day's events. It's not a coincidence if you have a dream about something that occurred that day. If you spend all day long at a soccer tournament and that night you have a dream about playing soccer, it makes sense because we are sifting through the day's events and we are encoding some of that information into our long term memory and pushing some of it aside. And we also have this theory called activation synthesis, which is a really interesting dream theory. The idea behind activation synthesis is that while you are dreaming, your brain is firing these random memories that you have in your association areas. They are memories for different people and places and things that you have experienced. And it's just random. And what your mind does is it attempts to put these random memories, these random ideas, into some kind of story. So it'd be as if you took a bunch of note cards and just wrote down different people that you know and different things that you've experienced, and you put them in a hat and you drew them all out and put them in a line, and then that's a story. Well, that's kind of like what dreams are sometimes like. It's why you have a dream that you're hanging out with your friend playing basketball, and then all of a sudden it's not your friend, it's your aunt, and you're not playing basketball anymore. You're on a cruise somewhere. Well, when you're having the dream, it all kind of makes sense. And then you wake up, you're like, man, that was a weird dream. And you try to tell someone, and people are turning into other people, and places are turning into other places. Well, that can be explained, at least in part, by the activation synthesis theory as to why we dream. Now, when we're sleeping, some other weird things can also happen that don't deal with dreams. And there are a number of different sleep disorders that can take place during a sleep cycle. For example, some people they struggle to simply fall asleep or stay asleep. And this is what we call insomnia. Now, insomnia is not I was up till 3 a.m. just playing on my phone or playing video games or watching TV. That's not insomnia. Insomnia is when you're consciously trying to fall asleep, but you can't. Some people with insomnia, they sleep 1 or 2 hours a night because they simply cannot fall asleep, or they do fall asleep, but they wake up every 20 minutes and they're wide awake. Narcolepsy is a really interesting sleep disorder that is characterized by these sleep attacks. It's not just that you get really sleepy in class and you put your head down and fall asleep. We're talking you could be wide awake, alert, talking to a friend, and then you immediately go into REM sleep. And as we talked in our last lecture, when you are in REM sleep, your body's paralyzed so you don't act out your dreams. So all of a sudden you collapse to the floor. Narcolepsy characterized by these sudden sleep attacks. It's a genetic disorder, and it deals with some chemicals in the brain that puts your body into this REM sleep, kind of out of nowhere. And we also have sleep apnea. And with sleep apnea, what happens here is the muscles in your throat, when you sleep, your muscles relax. Well, sometimes those muscles in your throat, they relax too much and it actually cuts off the airways. And you end up suffocating while sleeping. Now, you don't suffocate to death, but you have to wake up and catch your breath. And so you can see how disruptful this is to your sleep because you're constantly having to wake up, catch your breath, and then fall back asleep. Now, the other two disorders I have on this slide are kind of separated and they're in this little green box. We have night terrors and sleepwalking. And I have these separated because these are often confused. A night terror is when there is all of a sudden this heightened state of arousal while sleeping. Accelerated heart rate, can literally be running around the room and screaming, this rapid breath. Most people would say, well, this sounds like a nightmare, but it's not a nightmare, right? A nightmare is a scary dream that anyone can have. A night terror happens in deep sleep, in NREM3 sleep, where there's this heightened state of arousal. It's significantly more common with children, and the reality is most children who have night terrors grow out of it by the time they're about 10 years old. And sleepwalking is similar in the sense that sleepwalking may look, or people may falsely believe that they are acting out a dream, when in reality, sleepwalking is not taking place during REM sleep. Sleepwalking takes place during NREM3. It's also much more common with children, and again, most children grow out of it. Sleepwalking can happen when you're sleep deprived, when you're in unusual sleeping situations like staying over at a friend's house or maybe spending the night at grandma and grandpa's house. That's when we tend to see things like sleepwalking take place. And again, most of the time people grow out of it as they get a little bit older. Now, before we get into kind of this last altered state of consciousness, we're going to do a little bit of review with how neurotransmitters work in the synapse. You might recall that neurotransmitters cross through the synapse and they bind with the receptors of postsynaptic neurons. And they fit kind of like a lock and key. Remember, with our lecture, I had neurons that I drew as like triangles and circles and squares, and I said that they match up in this nice pattern. And when they match up at the receptors, that postsynaptic neuron gets excited and then it fires and sends the message along its way. Well, it's important that you understand that because sometimes we put chemicals into our body, specifically into our synapse, and they work in some mysterious ways with those particular receptors. So we call these agonists and antagonists. Agonists and antagonists are going to be chemicals that are in our synapse, that we put in our synapse, that do some different things. Agonist is a type of chemical, and what it does is it's going to bind with a receptor, and it is going to act as if it is a neurotransmitter. For example, I talked about endorphins, right? Well, an endorphin is like the body's natural painkiller. And what it does is if you stub your toe, your brain releases endorphins to help you cope with that pain. But if you break your toe, you might not be able to release enough endorphins. And so you take a painkiller, you take a synthetic painkiller. And what that does is it pretends to be an endorphin. It goes into the synapse, it binds with the receptor, and it works. It's kind of like a skeleton key. Like I have right here on my keychain, the key to get in my classroom. Dr. Kinchlow also has a key on his keychain that will unlock my door. Now, mine is designed for my door. His will still work. His will fit in the lock and it will still open the door, even though it's not technically designed for that specific doorknob. So it's like an agonist, a skeleton key. An antagonist, on the other hand, are really interesting because these chemicals, they will bind with receptors, like they'll fit into the receptor. However, they don't work. They don't get the neuron to fire. If anything, it just blocks the receptor from other neurotransmitters actually getting through. So you've maybe had the experience where you put a key into a keyhole and it fits, it goes into the lock, but the key doesn't turn. That's like an antagonist, right? So schizophrenia, for example, we know that for some people they experience schizophrenia because they have a ton of dopamine in their synapse. Well, the way that antipsychotic medications work, or some antipsychotic medications work, is they are antagonists for dopamine. So a person takes an antipsychotic medication, that chemical goes into their brain, it binds with dopamine receptors, it doesn't work, so the neuron doesn't fire thinking it's dopamine. But when that antipsychotic medication is in the synapse, what it does is it prevents actual dopamine from getting through. So that's the idea of an antagonist. So these drugs work differently in the synapse, whether or not they are agonists or antagonists. And so our final slide is going to look specifically at psychoactive drugs. Now, don't confuse that term. Psychoactive drug sounds like it's some kind of illegal drug that you can't have, right? But if something is classified as a psychoactive drug, all that means is it's a chemical that you've introduced in your body that impacts how you think, how you feel, and how you act. And psychoactive drugs don't have to be illegal. Like, I drink coffee every single day, and the caffeine that is in my coffee is a psychoactive drug. In fact, it's the most used psychoactive drug on the planet. If you take Tylenol, that's a psychoactive drug. So there's some things you need to think about when we're talking about these altered states of consciousness that are the result of using psychoactive drugs, which may or may not be illegal and abused. The first three terms that I have up there, you got to make sure you understand. So the first one is this idea of dependence. Dependence is just a fancy psychological term for addiction. And we have different types of dependence. We have physiological dependence and we have psychological dependence. Physiological dependence is when the brain chemistry actually adapts to the chemical itself. And so when you start to use a psychoactive drug, your brain adapts to being used to that drug. It's a physiological dependence. Psychological dependence is all the external things like peer pressure, like the warmth of my coffee mug in the morning. That's a psychological dependence, right? I enjoy what it feels like to hold my coffee mug every morning and get ready for that first sip of coffee. It's a psychological dependence. And so some people will make claims like, well, that drug is not addictive. I would argue strongly against that. There are lots of things that may not be physically addicting, but are certainly psychologically addicting. So we need to be cautious of that. And what's interesting is the more we use a drug, the more often we need it and the more of it that we need. The very first time that I drank coffee, I was bouncing off the walls. That caffeine did a lot to my brain and I was real jittery. Now I feel like I need 3 or 4 cups just to wake up. And this is the idea of tolerance. Tolerance is your brain, your body's adaptation to a drug. And the more you use it, the more often you need it to get that same particular feeling. If you, every single time you have the hint of a headache, you take Tylenol, your body will stop responding to that Tylenol as well. If you use it sparingly, then it will often be more effective when you do take the Tylenol. And then finally, there I have withdrawal. And withdrawal are going to be the negative things that we experience when a dependent drug is taken away. So if I show up to work someday and I take a look and I'm all out of coffee, I will likely experience withdrawal. I'll likely get really bad headaches. I might be a little grouchy. These are the negative experiences that happen when we take away a drug that we are dependent on. And then, as far as the types of psychoactive drugs or the classifications of drugs, we can classify drugs in a lot of different ways. We can classify them based off the chemical makeup, we can classify them based off the effect. Well, what you have here is we have these classified specifically on how they affect the body. And there are three main types of classifications. Now, it can certainly get more complicated than that, but for the sake of this course, three main types of classifications of drugs that you need to be familiar with: stimulants, which speed the body up, and you can see some examples there. Again, caffeine, the most widely used psychoactive drug on the planet. Depressants do the opposite, they slow the body down. And then hallucinogens, which create false perceptions. If you are familiar with these categories of drugs, you should be okay. We'll talk a little bit more about specific drugs. I have seen a question or two that have asked about a very specific drug. So it might ask, what does cocaine do in the brain, or what type of drug is cocaine? We'll go into a little bit more detail about that later. But hopefully this helped clarify altered states of consciousness. And if you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to ask. Best of luck.